Hey folks, Steve here with a special review video for you today. We are going to be looking at Nations in Arms, a game on the Napoleonic era from Compass Games. This was designed by Stanislaw Thomas, and we've spent the better part of a year playing this game with a whole playlist available on the channel of all the scenarios that I played. I did play most of them. So this review is based on my time, largely just playing solitaire through all of those scenarios. Um, this is going to be a usual sort of review video format for me, where I'm going to do some intro here. We'll spend some time talking about game mechanics, but at the end, we'll have my closing thoughts and remarks. There will be a timestamp here after the intro if you just want to skip to that and you think you already understand the way that the game works. We'll hit the game mechanics at a decent level, explain how the game works so you just understand the way the game operates and get a closer look at the components. But we'll save the real review remarks towards the end, so you can skip to that again if you'd like to. Just a couple of disclaimers on this one. The game was published some years back and was essentially out of print for a while. There was a time in 2019, and this is how I got the game, where Compass reissued the game with some newly printed rule books, the rule book and the playbook, um, back in 2019. And these, if you were to get a copy from Compass, though I think they may be out at this point, but if you buy the secondhand, it is possible that you will get the second printing uh, with the 2019 rules. These are an improvement over the original rules, but if you happen to have the game where you've purchased a copy of the game secondhand, you find you have the first printing rules, you probably want to change it up. So either get the PDFs of these second printing rules, or, and this is really my recommendation, go onto Board Game Geek, get yourself the Banania rules, which have been put up as a PDF in the file section, which is basically a user that goes by Banania went through and restructured the rules for clarity without adding any new rules. So this is still the same rule set, basically, with some reorganization to make it easier to use. And I did like it more than the second printing rules, for better or for worse. So I took the time and the money to print my own rule book and get it spiral bound at UPS store. Ended up working really great. So I would recommend doing that. And that is already going to be one of these challenges with this game as we talk about the review, is that you've got to be invested in this game. So I'll get that out of the way as well. If you want to play this game, you really should be invested in it. Not everyone will be, which is going to reduce the value of this game for a lot of folks. You really want to, you got to want to play it. You're going to want to understand it. You're going to want to make sure you've got a coherent set of rules that you and your friends have agreed to play. If you're going to do a multiplayer game, or if you're doing it solitaire, that you figure out what you want to do. I should also point out that there is an older rewrite, a rewrite that was based on the first printing rules, that was created by a user named Bjorn. Bjorn, I think that's his name, not his username, but Bjorn created the set of rules, but ended up adding some things to kind of fill in the cracks a little bit in some of the design. And so there are things that are in those rules that are not in, say, the Banania rules, the official rules. But it can be useful to look at Bjorn's rules if you're really caught in a situation where you need some sort of rules decision if something's not clear. Um, so the story of the game kind of has this weird issue where, again, the rules have always had a couple of weird spots. I do think if you just go with the Banania rules, you're going to do just fine. You're going to get through the game in pretty good shape, and it's worthwhile to play, certainly. For me, I'm the type of person that doesn't mind having to put a little bit of their own work into making the game experience a little bit better. So for me, this was, it was worth the effort to get a really good Napoleonic game. And generally speaking, this game has a lot of cool things that I think make it worthwhile for folks to pay attention to. The closest thing I can make as a non-Napoleonic parallel here is it does feel a little bit like a World in Flames of the Napoleonic era in terms of the scope and the time spent. If you're playing a grand campaign, this can certainly take probably several sittings. You're going to want to have friends come over or do dedicated play sessions for many hours and across either multiple days or multiple sessions, and then like you meet every weekend or whatever to knock it out. That especially for people who don't have the rules memorized. I got to the point from playing the game so much over the last year that I kind of could play very fast, and I knew what I wanted to do, and I could just go, go, go. Um, Players who are new to the game are not going to probably be able to do that, and that will only come with time. So expect, if you're going to play a grand campaign, to put many hours into that. There are a number of shorter scenarios that can be quite fun. The 100-day scenario, I think, is a good one. You can play a number of the War of the Second Coalition scenarios, and you can even play each grand campaign start scenario in 1805, 1809, or 1813 at basically as a shorter scenario. You play for a year of game time, so from 1809 to 1810, and play a shorter version of that, but you still have to kind of get everything out and set up. So watch out for that. Generally, I see this game when it sits compared to War and Peace. It does have certain advantages over it. We'll get to more of that in the mechanics part of the video and the final remarks. But I will say this game does stand on its own as a distinct gaming experience that's worth taking a look at. And we'll get into all of those details further on. I don't think there's any other major intro information I want to share other than saying that, as you'll see, this is a hex and counter game for the Napoleonic era by and large. There are cards. There are cards that do tactical stuff for battles and cards that do events. It's not a card-driven game, so don't think of it as that. The cards are assisting the game. So in terms of category, I would put this in the hex and counter category specifically. And I think with that, we can get into the mechanics. Now, maybe before I go, I should mention, I do not know if you're going to be able to get this game for much longer. The secondhand games you can sometimes get on Constant Marketplace or other places reasonably cheap. Whether we will ever see a reprint of this game or a deluxe edition that spruces everything up, I would say don't expect it. So if you can find the opportunity to pick it up, you might want to do that, if only because the supply of these games will be only so good. So you'll see one float around, you may want to pick it up because I think it's about to just be considered out of print until either Compass decides to do it again or the designer comes back to the design. He's actually designed a number of Napoleonic games. I think the most recent of which is probably Napoleon Against Europe, which is like a two-player area control card-driven game, which by being later you might think is that the most definitive game. We'll get to that a little later. So anyway, we're going to go to the mechanics of the game. If you want to stick around for that, sit back and relax. If you just want to skip to these further closing thoughts on the game, go ahead and skip to the timestamp that's going to show up on your screen. In talking to the mechanics of the game, I'm going to hit a couple of high-level sort of administrative things. One is the game is separated obviously by year as one marker of time, but each year is functionally 4 game turns that represent the 4 seasons. So in a given year, there will be a spring turn, a summer turn, an autumn turn, and a winter turn. The operation parts of the game do involve stacks of units moving from hex to hex and potentially engaging in combat, and is going to be pretty familiar to anybody that is used to that kind of maneuver warfare type of mechanics. So that's going to include interceptions, avoiding combat, all of that. The interesting thing that this game does to facilitate the operation or the intervals of players going is with a chit pull system. So within a spring turn, a summer turn, each of those turns you'll have a cup with a number of activation markers that will basically be drawn from the cup one at a time to determine who is able to activate and move up to the player's choice. Examples of these chits are like so. So you can see there's one for Empire, which will mean France and its allies, and then the Coalition, which will tend to be Britain, occasionally Austria, and its allies as forming up the coalition. The numbers here determine what leaders can actually activate by comparing that number to the leader's initiative rating. The leader's initiative rating is the very first number on the leader counter. So for these examples of Napoleon, Blake, and Esposi Mina, that's a 4, a 3, and a 5. When we draw the chit one at a time, and say we drew the Empire Land 3 chit, any leader with an initiative rating of 3 or higher can activate, which means that we could certainly activate Napoleon. And in fact, because Napoleon has a 5, and these chits only go 1 through 4, he can activate on basically every chit. If for some reason we instead had Udno in place, we would not be able to activate this force if instead the Empire Land 4 chit had been drawn, uh, and so that's sort of the limitation. You sometimes have leaders that have as low as an initiative of 2, and in which case that leader can only activate if a 2 or higher chit is drawn. So that's kind of how that comparison gets made over time. Likewise for the coalition, in this case, he could activate, but Blake could not because Blake is a 3 that is less than a 4. And what that means is while there's a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4 chit for your faction in the cup, you could draw a chit where not everyone can activate. And the order of the chit actually does matter too. So if you draw let's say, a coalition 1 chit, which means functionally every unit or stack can activate, and then your opponent draws their 4 chit, the 4 leaders or higher tend to be fewer in number, right? These represent very active, good leaders. There's only so many of those to go around. You could actually run into a case where you can activate everybody. Your opponent's chit comes out and it's a 4, and they can only move a couple of important stacks. And then you can activate nearly everything again with like a 2 chit, and that can almost give you the opportunity to like steal a march on a leader who's not very good. It's that chit pull mechanism that does provide for some uncertainty in how folks are going to activate. Do you choose to wait to activate Napoleon until later because you want to see what the enemy does first? All of those are the decision making things that you have to think about when playing the game. And I do find that it does help make the game more interesting. So, in addition to being a hex encounter game with cards, it also has chit pull, which, gosh, it's like mixing together all my favorite things in Wargame. So that's pretty interesting. Now, there are alternative initiative rules that are available in the rulebook and Banania's rules as well that you can opt to do initiative differently. I just went ahead with the rules as written, and I found that to be a pretty good way to do it. So again, as you are pulling these chits, you're able to activate the forces. When they activate, a leader can take control of his units. There are stacking limits. So, for instance, a leader with a 1 star next to them can basically stack and control 2 steps of units. So each star is worth 2 steps. So this leader could control this Spanish infantry, but that is the limit of their command. A leader with 3 stars can control up to 6. In this case, they just have 2 with them. If you have a 3-star leader, they can have a subordinate leader stacked with them. So we have this 2-star leader with Blake, but ordinarily you can't stack 2 2-star leaders. So There's a little bit. I mean, it sometimes it feels a little bit. I'm not sure the right word. Odd to work this way, where your stacking is limited based on your leaders, but it represents how you have organized your forces, and it does put some constraints on the player to make decisions. Well, the one really important exception to that stacking limitation is when you have an army. So when we have, let's say, Napoleon has an army, there is an off map box that is related to the Army of the North. So you can take a big stack, set them aside, replace them with this, and then reference the holding box. But if instead Napoleon had the Army of the North here, in addition to providing artillery points, which is what that 2 is for, it allows 4 other leaders to stack with Napoleon, as well as up to 18 steps of combat units. So the flip side of a leader is their ratings as a army commander, so a 5 initiative, 18 combat steps in his army, and a 3 combat modifier for Napoleon. If he's not an army leader, he's flipped to the other side, and you can see 503. That just means he's not in an army commander mode. He can still command up to 6 steps as a 3-star leader or higher. So armies are actually very important in this game. So in addition to providing that additional stacking bonus and the additional artillery, if you have an army in place, that also provides a zone of influence. So it's not quite as strong as a zone of control like in other war games, but in each of the hexes surrounding this force, there is a zone of influence, and that can be used to cut off supply. It can be used to force retreats situations to go much poorly for the retreating force. If a force has to retreat through a zone of influence, they can take additional step losses, that sort of thing. And it can be very important to have even 2 armies acting together in a local area, and then you have some really great opportunities for encircling an enemy force and defeating them. But if you do not have the army, and it's simply the leader with some core, some units here, they do not have a zone of influence, you can still intercept and whatnot in the hexes around a force, but they do so without a zone of influence, and it means that an enemy could trace supply right past you, as the case may be. So something to think about. There's basically, the armies are really good for holding a front. If you do not have an army, then it is possible for the enemy to slip around you if you can't intercept them, or even trace supply around you. And so you really need to watch out for that. That gets into some of the maneuver operational warfare bits of the system. Once you've actually activated a force, movement is going to be dependent on the units involved. So very generally, infantry are going to be your main or most the units you're going to have the most of, essentially, and they can have tend to be 6 movement points. There's one exception which we'll talk about, but generally 6 movement points, and cavalry will have 8. When you move, you can do an extended move, which is increasing the unit or the stack's movement points by 50%, but it does incur an attrition roll, which there's a table for. There are modifiers. It could lead to step losses, but you can basically use this as sort of like a strategic move. And the way that the attrition works, if you needed to move through your own friendly national territory for a power, a faction, you're less likely to take attrition. So you can kind of quickly move within interior lines if you have to, but generally 6 movement points. The terrain on the map varies. You can see, and I picked this as a good example because there's all sorts of types here in Spain: clear terrain, mountains, mountain passes, forests, and then the rivers. The rivers, if there are no bridges, actually cost 2 extra movement points. So you can see there's a bridge and Blake's hex. So to go from here to here would be 1, 2 movement points. To move through a mountain pass, you do have to enter the hex side in the sort of like the path of the mountain pass. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4 if we wanted to pass through that way. And then mountain hexes themselves take 4 movement points, and then to actually leave a mountain, even to go from here to here, adds 2 more movement points. So you certainly will be avoiding wanting to walk through mountains unless you have to. You're going to want to cross rivers at river crossings. There are engineering units which can be used to create pontoon bridges through the different areas, but it's something that I really didn't do as much as maybe I should have, or I didn't rely on it. Armies also have an inherent engineer to where, so like here's a Prussian engineer unit. It can move with a stack and it can be flipped to create a bridge over a river. And that can be important if again, you want to get around the river or over the river quickly. So the terrain does matter. The terrain types will provide uh, combat penalties, typically to the attacker, reducing their modifiers on their combat die roll. Rivers and whatnot will also be a big factor for supply. So as you move, you can really most stacks are going to be able to move faster than their supply can catch up to them. Essentially, is one way to look at it. So from wherever you're at, you need to trace supply back 4 movement points to a supply link. A supply link is either a fortress that you control within your faction or your force, or it is a supply depot, or it is a detachment. A detachment looks like this, and it is functionally a unit. You create a detachment by voluntarily reducing an infantry unit by 1 step, and that 1 step basically becomes this detachment. You can count, 1, 2, 3, or 4 to the detachment, and then it can count 4 movement points back to another link. Could be another detachment, or a depot, or a fortress that you control. Here is a depot. They're actually supply baggage trains. These can provide positive, beneficial modifiers for attrition, but you can also drop them and they become depots, and they do functionally serve as a combat unit to defend only if they're by themselves, but basically that is now a supply link, and you need to trace back to a fortress in that power's home country. So tracing back to, in this very basic example, Bayonne, which is in France, that's a supply source. So we count 1, 2 to Saint Sebastian. We have a French control marker here where the French control it. They've reactivated it, which we'll talk about here shortly, but they've basically taken control of it fully. That's a supply link, and then we count a couple more back to Napoleon, and that would be how we know that Napoleon is in supply, whereas the Spanish are either already nearby a home fortress like Madrid, or can count 4 movement points back to one. Supply is pretty important, obviously. If you find yourself out of supply, you're going to take greater attrition. You will also suffer pretty nasty combat penalties, such that part of the maneuver warfare of the game is to try to cut off supply and then force a combat. And you should not interpret that, by the way, as being, oh, we all of a sudden we're out of gunpowder, when you just, say came behind my lines. Maybe more like, let's see, it's going to be tough to create a manufacturer's situation like this, but something like this, and there's no clear way to trace supply back to Saint Sebastian within 4 movement points. You could do this and maybe try to attack. It's not necessarily that Napoleon's suddenly out of gunpowder entirely, but that well, I guess it is a little bit because you lose artillery capability when you're out of supply, but it's also to represent that the enemy has gotten into your rear and has cut off your line of communication, and that is what affects your troops' combat ability, more so than just all of a sudden we're out of rations or something. That's not necessarily what's being represented if your supply is cut and then a combat occurs. So just something to think about there in terms of the rules interpretation. So again, the moving, relatively straightforward. When you go to attack a force, if you fight and you win a combat, you can keep moving, but it costs one extra movement point to have fought the battle. So you can kind of slow some things down. If you have 5 to 1 odds, it's an overrun, and you would simply remove the enemy at that point. But that only happens when you have a very, very large force catching a much smaller force that failed to avoid combat. Avoiding combat and interception works much like you might suspect, where as you enter a nearby hex, that force has the opportunity to try to intercept. There are some die roll modifiers. Cavalry will help and will move you into the hex. You'll get a bonus to combat and you'll fight. Avoiding is actually much easier in this game than almost anything else, where as the enemy enters your hex, you roll to avoid before combat, and then they could chase you effectively. You add the initiative of the leader. There are some other die roll modifiers, but I'll just to summarize it quickly. Avoiding combat is very easy so long as the initiative of the defender is about the same as the attacker. In these situations where Napoleon has a higher initiative, he reduces the ability of that leader to get away, and more often than not, those higher initiative leaders can catch lower initiative leaders that are trying to get away. So again, a whole representation there of the maneuver combat, and especially in some scenarios where there are not standout leaders in some theaters, it is much harder to actually bring the enemy to battle unless they want to fight. So something to think about. The different unit types, just to kind of talk through that very quickly, you see an example of a cavalry and an infantry. Each counter is usually a 2-step corps. And so this is 2 steps of cavalry, 2 steps of infantry. That first number, if this unit is used as the lead assault unit, which means it takes the first step loss in combat, it adds a +2 to the French die roll, which is very strong. It has 1 artillery, and its morale is 4. So that's not movement, and that could be very confusing. If you're learning this game, that is not movement. That is not movement. That is a morale rating, and that matters for combat. Here you can see the cavalry has no bonus and no artillery, but cavalry is actually very important. When a combat actually occurs, the die roll modifiers that do matter are one, there's a force ratio modifier. So if you have 3 to 1 odds, you get a +2. If you get 2 to 1 odds, that's a +1. Who has more artillery? That's going to give you a bonus. Who has more cavalry steps will give you additional bonuses. And then that lead assault modifier, leaders all come together to influence that die roll. The size of the battle also matters a whole lot, where you take the combined number of steps of both sides. If that reaches a certain threshold, it will go from a skirmish, which is 9 steps altogether or less, to I'm sorry, 8 or less. It's a skirmish. 9 to 20 steps is a minor battle, and then 21 and beyond is a major battle. That really affects how bloody the combat will be, and it actually means if a gigantic army attacks a smaller army, but not enough to overrun it, it could still be a minor or major battle, and it could end up being very bloody for the larger force. So there's a little bit of, you got to watch out. It's easy to throw men into a wood chipper if you're not being thoughtful with where you're sending your men, and what the frontage essentially is there, and how things operate. So um, the benefit there being, if you do truly outnumber the enemy, they suffer a penalty for the force ratio, and that will minimize the losses you'll take, but you'll still take some. And again, the major battle table can get pretty bloody, removing several corps from a combat. So that's the basic operating model of the game. When you go to Siege, you basically spend the movement point. You spend a movement point equal to the fortress strength, so 2 or 1, and then you roll on the siege table. There are modifiers for that based on your artillery, if you have engineers, if it's an army, the leader involved in the siege. And sieges can actually end very quickly, which is appropriate to this era. Sometimes they will take a little while, but often enough concentrated force and effort will cause the fortresses to fall. When you take it, you can either spend a baggage train or a step from your units to reactivate the fortress, meaning it is back to its full strength under your control. And that's how you really begin to build out supply lines in enemy territory. The net effect of that is you slowly, as you penetrate the enemy's home country, start to lose more oomph. You're losing men to garrison. You're losing maybe to attrition. You're spending manpower fighting actual battles, and you can get to the point where you really do wear away a lot of your force fighting in enemy territory, while the defender can make use of interior lines, being able to trace from multiple angles to get supply, and that's all part of the real gameplay that you'll find at the operational level. Overall, I think that this combat system, the overall operational model for land combat is strong. It's good. It does make maneuver matter. It makes the difference in leaders matter a whole lot. You can have very active leaders who aren't necessarily good at combat, like this leader. You can kind of have average leaders like Blake here, who can activate with a 3 in a 1 combat, and then you have very good leaders who are like Napoleon. There are a few others that may have activation ratings of 4 or 5 and a combat bonus of even 2. A 4 initiative leader with 2 combat is a fantastic leader, and you'll definitely want to make sure that you can use them to great effectiveness. You will sometimes have leader losses in combat. That can happen, and it's usually either the leader, the subordinate leader, who could also add their combat bonus to the battle. So we'll swap out Oudinot for Lamarck here. We could add both Napoleon's modifier and Lamarck's, but it could mean Lamarck dies or is wounded. So something, it's a bit of the risk management aspect of the game you need to consider. If a leader does die or becomes wounded, you can pull another leader from the pool of leaders that you have and replace him, but you could get a worse leader because that's done randomly. Again, I think this is a good system. I think it helps. It's better than if this were, I think in War and Peace, by comparison, the leader fidelity is a little bit different. There's fewer ratings, which means less ability to differentiate leaders. This game, there are multiple aspects that matter. A leader is a number of things. It's initiative, it's combat, it's how many steps can they command if they're an army leader, or maybe they're not even allowed to become an army leader like Lamarck here. He has an X instead of a 0. He is not allowed to be an army commander, where other leaders can, but they might not be as good. So there's a lot of interesting decisions to make there. The different combat types makes you think about the force ratios, the types of units and how good they are at what they're supposed to be doing. It matters a whole lot. There are different types of cavalry. In combat, what you can have happen is if it's a minor battle or larger, if you lose, your force could become demoralized, and that's what the morale ratings are for. So you look and say, what's the morale of the force? It's the number that shows up the most in that force. So here we get to pick 5. If we lost a minor battle, we would have to roll higher than a 5 to become demoralized, which is harder, right, than if your morale was, say, a 3. You also get benefits for your leader, but basically how badly you lose that fight actually affects the likelihood of becoming demoralized. And if you do become demoralized, then you are going to suffer pursuit step losses from enemy cavalry that survived the battle. So even just describing everything here, you can see that there are multiple layers to the combat that's connected to the operational model of what forces are you bringing to bear, what are they going to be capable of achieving. Attached to that being the supply and the operational scale matters, and we'll talk about production here just soon enough. So you can imagine even playing the shorter scenarios where production and diplomacy don't matter as much, there's plenty of meat here in terms of maneuvering your forces, getting the right leaders involved, having the combats, knowing how to manage that can be, I think, a pretty fun time, and I feel pretty satisfied with the fidelity of the mechanics here for this scale, especially in the game. Let's next talk a little bit about naval warfare. It's going to be a little bit a little bit easier to talk to because it's not super intense, but definitely an aspect worth talking about. The naval mechanics in this game are handled a little bit differently. You can obviously tell it's not a hex-based system, but they do have their own impulse markers that are drawn from the chit. So the Empire and the Coalition each have a naval chit, and in fact, they have two. The Coalition here example has a two, a one, as opposed to the land markers where uh, the number indicates an initiative. They're purely numbered for differentiation. They could have, I guess, ignored the number, but just to help be specific, some scenarios will say remove the number two markers. Once a year, each side can decide to put their two chit for naval stuff into the cup, and I found it is best to put that into summer, so you have the greatest likelihood of actually getting to use that second chit. I guess I should quickly mention that due to the way the game works with the chit pool, spring turns, fall turns, and winter turns can end early if you draw the winter quarters chit. For spring, it only ends after the third time, rather that this is drawn from the cup, and you count them. You need some way to mark that. I use just random stuff to keep track. For fall, or autumn, it's after you've pulled it twice, and winter is when you've pulled it the first time. So some turns can actually end very quickly, depending on how you pull that winter quarters chit. So in summer, you don't put that winter quarters chit in at all, and so you know you're going to play every single chit in the cup during a summer turn, and then you'll know that you'll get to play both your naval chits at that point. So that's just my personal recommendation. When you pull either chit, you basically can move all of your fleets up to their movement factor, which will tend to be 8. It's on the back of the chit. Kind of hard to see at this angle, I can understand, but it's 8. And basically, each move out to sea costs 1 movement point, to move to another sea zone is a movement point, and so on. So you can actually get pretty far across the map if you have a destination in mind. But if you find yourself moving between sea areas fighting different battles, that can quickly take away your movement points. And if you're trying to transition between different ports, you'll also run out of movement points relatively quickly. These, it should be pointed out, the naval units do care about the ports. So these are the locations on the coasts that have these boxes next to them. That indicates there is at least a port. A white box indicates that's a shipyard, which means if you were to build new ships during production, they would have to show up in these white box areas. The numbers inside are denoting the trade value of that port, which is something we'll talk more about when we talk about production. When we do the naval thing, it will be, you can have up to 3 naval units in a given location. So 3 naval units in the port, in the box, which we'll talk about here in a second, and then at sea. And if you have any more than that, they have to be either removed or you're just passing through the sea zone. So up to 3, which kind of puts an outer band on what you're capable of achieving with any given squadron of fleets here. Each counter represents a fleet, so more than one ship technically, and is led by the admiral, which is the name on the counter itself. So Mississippi is this one. I'm probably not saying that right. The fleets are noted for their maneuver value, which is the first one, which is used for certain things like avoiding combat or maneuvering. The second value, or the far side value, is the die roll bonus. So when you're in combat, if you have a naval combat, so we'll just manufacture a situation here, you're going to get a die for each fleet. So you can imagine if you're fighting 3 fleets to 1 fleet, 3d6 versus 1d6 is going to be very bad for that single fleet. So the force composition and force projection, fleet and being stuff starts to kick in here. But you roll your 3 dice, and then you're going to add the bonuses for the fleets. So for the British here, it would be 3d6 plus 4, 1 plus 1 plus 2, and same thing for the French here. And you can imagine that you're going to get pretty close results just due to the probability curve, and then the bonuses are similar. If it's tied, you can fight another round of battle, if the loser only loses by a couple points, because you compare the totals, it may just mean that they retreat. So they might retreat to another sea zone. They might retreat to a port. Um, if you win by enough of a difference, that's when ships are removed. So starting with a difference of 4 or higher, you may remove a fleet. You could remove multiple if the difference is very significant. But you tend to get a lot of retreat results in this system if the fleets opposing each other are equal in strength and bonuses. But even a slight difference in the bonuses could have a pretty significant effect on the probability results. And so there's a whole little, I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'll just brush over. You definitely want to be looking at your probabilities. What are the chances that the French fleet can actually contest the French, or I'm sorry, the French fleet can actually contest the British and vice versa, but the British will tend to have the greater advantage. When you have ships in port, that will keep that port from being easily invaded, navally invaded, amphibiously invaded, which is why it's sometimes useful just to have the fleets in port and be fine with being blockaded. But a blockade means uh, that you have ships in port and the enemy is in the blockade box, which is what these squares are. And these guys are effectively trapped now. To exit to the Bay of Biscay, they have to fight their way past this blockading fleet. If they manage to do that, then these guys have to retreat out, and they can go where they want to go, but they are stuck having to break out of the blockade. Likewise, these guys could try to attack the ships in the port, but they are going to have a number of defensive advantages in the harbor. Um, so you'll end up in this state where blockading will happen quite a bit just because the risk involved in attacking the harbor itself is not so good for the attacker, and it will be hard for the fleet that wants to break out to actually do so, because if it's a tied battle, they may end up just simply retreating back into the harbor. They can't get out, or they manage to roll very well and their opponents roll poorly, and they can force a retreat back. Um, so, really the French are just trying to use their own fleets to defend their harbors a lot of the time, or if they eventually can build up enough strength to try to defeat the British Navy and get in place for an invasion of the home isles. Invasions can be done. So in this case, we'd have these 3 fleets. Each fleet can basically transport a corps and the support units like baggage train and leaders, where they've got to be here together, and then you move them to wherever your destination is going to be, and then these guys get dropped off. They have to try to get the fort, fight a battle, and then take the fort, or they get pushed back and have to return home, and that's going to use up some of their activations. They'll be marked with activation markers. We didn't really talk about that, but basically every time a force is activated, they get an activation marker. If they activate again, then their activation is over. So each force can activate twice. The second time will accrue an attrition check, so you got to watch out for that. But that's basically it. The other thing will be there are straits here, which means the French could cross into Britain or vice versa here at Dover. But if the enemy has a fleet in the sea zone that the strait is in, you cannot make that move. So France cannot move to Dover, but Britain could try to get into Boulogne because they control the sea zone. So the fight over the channel can sometimes be can be a hotly contested item if the French fleet is in pretty good shape. And that's basically the big stuff you need to worry about for naval things. So let's talk about diplomacy and production next, which will be really the bulk of the rest of the rules mechanics explanation. Don't mind the scattered remnants of a previously played scenario here, but in talking about diplomacy, so something that makes this game, again, a hallmark of the game is the use of the probability curve to control how things happen. Your bell curve when you're using 2d6. So while the avoiding combat and interception mechanics, we use 2d6, and your target is usually a 10, which means that with a few modifiers, you can sometimes very reasonably expect to be successful in that. Diplomacy uses a similar system where a power is going to target a minor country
or another major power if it's not played by a human person at the table, um, with a 2d6 and then modifiers based on a couple of factors. You can spend money to get some bonuses. That's a resource sink to put money into. There's also a few circumstantial bonuses, like you can have a greater chance of influencing Russia as the coalition if France has created the Duchy of Warsaw. That can be a factor. And then there's also natural bonuses. So to use Sweden as an example, here's the Swedish chit just to show their diplomatic status on the back. You can see there's some markers here that Prussia has a +1 bonus, Russia has a -2, and Britain has a +2. So this helps to reflect the attitudes of the time that Sweden generally wanted to be in the coalition, allied to Britain, but did not like Russia and would be okay maybe with Prussia a little bit. And those modifiers can actually have a pretty significant influence on those die rolls and the likelihood of getting a 12 on the 2d6. A 12 is hard to get, right? You're either very lucky by rolling two sixes, or you're still rolling reasonably well and you have enough of those modifiers to make the threshold. So, each turn, not just at the beginning of a year, but each turn, the major powers have an opportunity to influence minors and majors in this way. You get basically one attempt for free, and then you can pay money to get an additional attempt. So it's very thoughtful to say, hey, I want to swing Sweden into my side. I want to swing some other minor power. Maybe it's, I'm trying to think like Mecklenburg or the Hansa or Denmark. There's not that many minors that can be influenced, but it does factor into decision making in the overall strategic aspect. And the influence of major countries is actually a huge part of the campaign game to determine when can Prussia join, when will Russia betray France and fight against, or yeah, when will Britain convince Russia to fight France and all of that good stuff. So there's a few other mechanics related to an optional alliance credit system that I cover in a different video in the playthrough. That's just another mechanism to reach certain historical conclusions. I won't spend much time talking about that. But generally, diplomacy is straightforward. If you manage to convince a minor to join your side, you can set up their units. There's a chart for that to tell you what to set up, and they join your side. If you convince a major to join you, a major always already has units on the board, and you can get them to do what you want them to do on the game map. So diplomacy, pretty straightforward, but it is deeply baked into the overall strategic aspects of the game. Opening a new front, having more production to get more units on the board to do things, and basically forcing your opponent to deal with a whole new set of uh, economic concerns, right? That's a huge factor.
So now talking about production, we'll do uh, production once a year. You do that in the spring as part of the spring interphase. So when you get to a new year of whatever scenario you're playing that has production, is when you will do it. The major powers of France, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia will all do production, as well as Spain and Turkey. If you have an unplayed power, then depending on who that major power is, either Britain or France will control their production within some limitations. I'll go ahead and say that I do recommend, if you're going to be playing this, using a spreadsheet to do production just to kind of help keep things straight. Because you're going to get, like, knowing how much you can build in terms of the money you get is not difficult, but keeping careful track of how many steps you've built and the maximum amount of steps that you can even build for combat units is important, and you'll want to keep track of that over time. And I found a spreadsheet works pretty good for that. And I can't necessarily recommend my spreadsheet's really great or anything. So I suggest you kind of figure out your own maybe. But for what I had to do for my gameplay, that sure helped a lot. The way that the production works is, one, you're going to have the minor resources chart, which will list for the given campaign year what the production is for the miners, or who they belong to, or who they're allied to, and that will explain how much money they make, plus whatever commerce from trade, which we'll talk about in a second, and then how many steps they can build
The major powers will have their own breakout on a separate player aid sheet that will tell you basically, for the scenario, how much money do they make at the start of the scenario, how much will they make via trade, and then how many combat units can they build, and then of that, how many can be cavalry steps. So just as an example here, 1798 scenario, Russia can build 18 combat steps total, 6 of which can be cavalry. You can see their money there, 53 plus 5 from commerce. That should be important to point out that the commerce comes from these trade ports, those areas out there that I had mentioned are uh, basically the trade value of the harbor and how much income comes from the trade. If a faction is allied with Britain, both Britain and that ally get that money for that port. If a power is neutral, then Britain and that power will get that money. If a power is allied to France or is France, then no one gets that money. So this is one of those things where if you are France, right, and you're adding allies to your cohort, that's great, but they're going to be missing out on some of the income because they're part of the continental system. So France and its allies are part of the continental system. If you achieve or complete the full continental system, and the rules I wish were a little clear on the wording of this, but it makes sense. If you establish the continental system by completing it, meaning from St. Petersburg up in Russia all the way along the coast of Europe up to Trieste is part of the continental system. That will mean that it is completed, and if you can hold that for 2 winter turns, France can automatically win the game. While it is in that state of being completed, when you have a production turn, France gets the money from all of that trade. The the Allied power does not get that money, but apparently France does, but only if it's completed. So the game state required to make that completed is really tough, right? You have to have Russia in there. You have to have Swedish Pomerania, which means Sweden has been dealt with to some degree. Uh, the Hansa is in that. Mecklenburg, Holland, France, Spain, Portugal, and much of Italy, and then some of the Austrian holdings over here, you have to have under French control, which is kind of hard to achieve. But if you do it, France gets a bunch of money for however long they can hold on to it. So watch out for that. But the trade is a big factor on the income. There is a mini game of French corsairs versus British fleets where the French do have some special naval units that they can build and can deplete or impact how much of the trade money Britain gets. Britain can offset that with naval units being sent off map to fight the corsairs. I won't show all of that. It's a pretty straightforward mechanic, but that is handled as part of production as well. Now that's for trade. Your regular based production is going to come from a value that's stated on the charts, but that value does come from somewhere, and while it's a bit obfuscated to a degree, there are ways to understand the value of a province based on how much money it makes. There is sort of this undeclared amount of money that if you took every province of a power away except for their capital province, they would still make a lump sum of money. I think that's just abstracting the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But if you say uh, have a province that is annexed from your power and annexed by someone else, you will lose 3 production if it is a non-key province. And a key province is one like Lyon here as part of the Dauphine province that has a little red star next to the capital. That means it's a key that is a key city, fortress. It's also a key province. If that province is annexed by an enemy, then France would lose 6 production, not 3. So regular province that gets annexed, like say Magdeburg from Prussia. Prussia loses 3 production. If for some reason we had annexed East Prussia out there, which is a key province, then Prussia would lose 6 production, and the annexing power would gain that 3 or 6 production. If an enemy has fully occupied a province by controlling all of its fortresses, they don't just get it, they actually have to annex it in a peace deal. But while it is occupied, you lose 2 production, basically 2 of the 3, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of figure out the production model that like a province tends to be worth 3 or 6 production, um, but you still end up with a big lump sum for the capital, even if you lost every other province. What it does mean is you can, over time during a campaign game, erode production of a power by annexing more provinces from them over time. That will reduce their ability to build units. Even militarily occupying their territory before a peace deal is fully signed will also impact production, though they'll always get a little bit for the areas that you've occupied. So the production isn't terribly complicated, but you do want to think about how to implement it. So you work out, what's the easiest thing to do is to look at what you started with from the scenario and then look at what you have gained or lost, and then you can kind of just work off of the baseline. I found that to be the easiest thing rather than try to tackle it a different way. Once you've gotten your production done, though, that is where you're going to do the production. And again, you're limited based on the number of combat units. Different combat units are worth a different amount to purchase. So to purchase a regular step of infantry is 3. Light cavalry is 5. You can see the charts here. And then anytime you're building up a unit that has artillery, you actually have to pay extra for the artillery point. And that's something that you could easily miss, is to not pay for that artillery. So please watch out for that. There's examples in the rule book so you understand how that works. So to build up a full infantry corps should cost 7 production points. A infantry corps has 2 steps, right? So it's 2 steps, that's 6 plus 1 artillery usually for an infantry corps. That would be 7 production points. So you can imagine for a second that if you say have 50 production points, you might be at most building 7 corps, but there are other things to purchase, like the supply depot baggage markers that cost 2 production. Army markers cost 8 production, so they're pretty expensive, but they give you those extra capabilities. So there's a balance to be had of buying combat units up to the maximum if you have enough money to do that, but also purchasing the additional items like engineers and the baggage trains and the armies to be sort of supporting factors for your forces that will be important. It should also be pointed out that fleets are terribly expensive. To build even a single fleet costs 20 production. So it is very hard. Once a side has kind of lost its fleet, you're not going to be expecting to see that fleet bounce back unless you have a huge amount of income and can afford to rebuild your fleets. So that is definitely something you have to watch. And if Britain all of a sudden starts losing its fleets, then it could be really hard for it to catch back up again. So the production model is pretty good. I'd say, it does take some time for you to figure out what you're going to build, what you're going to do, where you're going to put it. Are you spending the right money? So please use a spreadsheet. Keep that easier for yourself. And generally, it is some downtime as you progress to the new year of having to sit down and work out the production, work out what you build. And that's why it does feel a little bit like World in Flames, where you have a lot of action and then you inevitably have a cooldown period where the players are all kind of working out what they're building for the next year. The placement of those units all being very important to how will the next spring, summer turns go for the campaigns that are to be executed. So by and large, that's a lot of the game. There's plenty of nuance and detail and complexity within the rules that I didn't cover here, or else this video would be much too long. But hopefully that gives you a sense of the way that the game operates. It does work pretty well together. Just to look very quickly at the components, the map is 2 sheets side by side. It's actually quite a large map. in terms of needed coverage. It is bigger than two standard size maps put together. So it is a sort of non-standard map measurement, but the map is very pleasant to look at. As you can see, like I like it more than most other Napoleonic War Game hex encounter maps that I've seen at this level. It is very pleasing to the eye. The terrain is clear. The territory borders that they use to show like this blue outline for France, black for Prussia, is useful. The color is appropriate and it's non-intrusive. And I would think more games should follow this model because I think it works really really well for making it clear what is what. And I mean, this, I hate to draw a comparison, but like compared to War and Peace, this map is just much nicer looking, much more coherent, I think, and it just the usability during the game, this works just a lot better. The game does have a number of different markers to denote sieges, siege length that can go for multiple impulses in all the units that I've already shown. I will say that the game has control markers, and I don't like them. So this is a French control marker, so this denotes France controls whatever this is on. The backside is Austrian, and then you've got to kind of fish around for Spanish or Russian or whatever. What I did, and these are components that do not come with the game, is I used wooden discs that I happen to have of varying colors that are appropriate for the powers to help provide a more clear, quick, colorful way to denote ownership, and that worked really well for me. So again, there's another instance maybe of like having to put extra work into a game to bling it out, but I just found that worked better for me. You can pick up these kind of discs at Meeple Shop or whatever websites. You can look up board game components and find these sorts of things, get them in a variety of color, and you can use them for multiple games. But that helped me a lot. So that maybe is one weakness, or the control markers aren't as good. But otherwise, then the player aid charts are basic. There's a terrain one that has the color, the hexes on them, so you can clearly identify them. The player aid sheets are generally clear, and the tables are all fine and dandy. But there's only one copy of these, so if you're going to be playing a multiplayer game, you're going to need to print more, which is kind of a bummer. And I don't necessarily like that, but you can hang tough with that if you have to. Before we wrap up this section and move on to the final review bits and commentary, I did want to show the cards. So again, the different cards out here. There are gray cards that are useful during any time period. There are a set of cards during the Revolutionary period, which is the War of the First and Second Coalitions, and then the Imperial period, which are blue cards for 1805 and beyond. You can see they tend to tell you what year they become available to be in the deck, so you can sort of stage the cards out by year. And then you can see there's usually a title, a piece of artwork, and then the game impact. And some of them can be actually very powerful, and if played at the right time, can definitely shift things. So these do add a significant degree of, if not chaos, just special things that you can't always account for, or you have to know the cards are out there and these things could happen. That hidden element is useful. So there's a lot of different cards in here. Again, I think the artwork added really helps connect with what the card is meant to represent. The cards are generally pretty nice. They're like standard card quality as far as I would, as I would say, compared to any other cards and games. Nothing special, but they work just fine. They work good. They fit into the card box holders that I have. The tactics cards are just a little bit different. They're the same quality in terms of component, but you can see that they have various direct combat related effects. And these can be quite useful as well. And they can actually change what might have been, a much tougher battle into something that could go the way of the person who might have expected to lose. But there's always, unknown factors that come in here. Sometimes you get cards that you're not going to use or aren't even useful in the circumstances, and they're based on a card draw. So you might draw a few cards and not get any that are useful, and then your opponent gets a bunch of really good ones. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I do think they add a lot more to the game in terms of again adding an element that is not purely a calculation. It's just stuff that's much harder to account for, and helps add, if not a fog of war element, a just chaos of war element, which I quite liked. I think it was a value add to the system. It's probably why other games that the designer has made have either a card element or a random event chit draw that functions basically as a card element. So I kind of get where he was coming from with that. Okay, with that, guys, I think that's a whole lot of talking. Hopefully, you get a good sense of how the game potentially works. You can obviously watch all the playthrough videos to get a much grander sense of how it plays out in the course of a game. But we'll head on over to the final thoughts part of the video, and we'll get wrapping up here.
Okay, so we're gonna just wrap up the video here with some discussion on what I thought of the game. I alluded to a little bit of this in the introduction. I do genuinely think that this is a fantastic game. I really like it, and I'm really glad that I have it. This is another game that I think falls into um, the spot where it's not going to work for everybody. Okay, if you need absolute clarity on all the rules that come in the box and it's just perfect the way it is, uh, this might be a little much for you. Again, I think you have to put a little bit of the work in, getting down at least downloading the PDF of the Banania rules, or getting them printed, which ended up being very handy at the table for me as I learned the game and played it. Um, but when you take the game holistically in terms of what it's doing and what it's portraying in the different scenarios that it has, that many other Napoleonic games simply just don't have. Right? You don't really see a War of the First Coalition, other than maybe a game does a little bit of lip service to that by having a Napoleon, Bonaparte in Italy kind of thing, where it's like an intro scenario. This game has a full-bodied War of the First Coalition scenario, which is awesome, and there's plenty for the Second Coalition. I mean, you're really playing every war of the coalition in the period, during the Revolutionary period to the Imperial period. You have coverage of all of them in some shape or form, and I think that's really strong. That's a really cool thing. There's not a single grand campaign that runs you all the way from 1792 to 1815. There is a magazine game by the same designer called Pitt's War that does do something like that, but that game's much more zoomed out and higher level than this. But for what you get, I think you get a good differentiation of the leaders. I think you get good differentiation of units and unit types, so that it's not all simply strength points, but there are some core within a faction that are better than others, and you need to kind of strategically think about where you're going to put your units and your leaders. The diplomacy aspects feel at least a bit better than, say, War and Peace, which the system used in that game uses a single d6 and some modifiers, and it just feels a little wonky. I think Stanislav did a very good job, basically figuring out the right way to do the probabilities, right? You use a bell curve, the modifiers matter a bit more. You really have to invest into diplomacy if you want to do diplomacy, and I think that's very important. Um, and then the interplay of the way, if you're playing the two-player game, your alliances with the major powers work, I think, is also very interesting. And I have a whole 45-minute video where I talk about appreciating those design aspects. So that's, if you really want to go deep into me kind of talking through all of that, that's a separate video called Appreciating the Design on the channel. You can watch separately from this. We won't hit all those points here, but the game does a lot of really interesting things. And if there are drawbacks, it's that, again, there are undercooked bits of the rules where sometimes you kind of have to figure something out, or maybe in tough situations it's hard to tell what the game wants you to do if this weird situation comes up. and you're gonna have to just make a decision. Um, so that's kind of a bummer. That's going to rub people the wrong way. But I think for everything else that the game does, um, I think at one point I heard Ardwolf from Ardwolf Slayer, Gary, describe this game as the designer's masterpiece on the Napoleonic era. And that depends on the designer, right? Is it a good designer's masterpiece? And this designer's done a number of Napoleonic games. I think this one does something that feels very special. It can play a really good two-player game. It can provide a compelling multiplayer game, assuming you play with 5 people and maybe not more than that. The Ottomans and the Turks and the Spanish aren't maybe terribly interesting to play independently, but you can do both. And there's certainly cases where, like, if you're going to play Empires in Arms, you're playing that multiplayer. If you're going to play Napoleon against Europe, you have to play that two-player because I think that's all that you can do. Here you can do both, and both are pretty good. Both can provide a compelling game experience, and there's enough meat here and special mechanics that are kind of chromy that you do feel like you're in the era. You're playing a game that is the era, not the mechanics make sense to the era and the historical context that the games are in. The cards do help. They provide that extra bit of flavor. They allow you to do some special things, and your opponent might not be suspecting them. So there is a little bit of a hidden resource element here. The surprises that may come up, and even the tactics cards provide some additional things if you want to get it out of this very more predictive model of how a combat might go. The cards can shift that quite a bit, and you can optionally use the tactical deck for every battle if you really wanted to, or at least all minor and major battles, not just major battles. I chose to do it in my playthroughs with just major. It made things more eventful when it was a really big fight, but I could see where using those cards even for minor battles, which there are a lot more of, could be much more exciting, or could be adds a lot more unknown factors to the game. So I think altogether everything there, the operational model works pretty well. You can still make decisions at that operational scale that feel pretty good. Um, the strategic layer matters a lot. You do have to make the very big decisions on where am I going, where am I going to commit my forces, as France, for instance, as Britain, where am I going to land my expeditionary force, what can I do to affect diplomacy. I need to have a true grand strategy for defeating Napoleon that may take years to properly to implement. All of that feels really great. I mean, it just it's a big game. It's a big game that takes up a lot of footprint. If you wanted to have things be pretty reasonably organized, like I did, and again, it takes time. But all of those things together make a really great game. So I think this sits along with another game from Compass that I really quite like End of Empire, where yeah, you might have to put a little bit more effort into getting the best version of the rules, and some things that you kind of have to really analyze of the rules, how they should work. But if you're able to do that, I mean, you're just getting a game that is really quite good, really enjoyable. I'm kind of thinking I'd like to shop this to my World in Flames group to say, hey guys, let's take a break from World War II and World War One, and let's do Napoleonic era. I think that might be really fun to try it and see how that works with folks. It's yeah, it's fun. So if you can't tell, I like it. I recommend it if you can deal with those rules shopping that you're going to have to do. And you can find it, because again, I do not think that this is going to be readily available. You are going to have to go onto the secondhand market and pick up a copy, because I think the original printing's rules were pretty bad. A lot of folks sat on this game and didn't play it, didn't really use it. They may be looking to offload a copy. That may be your opportunity. If you have the game and it's sitting on your shelf and you've ignored it for the last few years, get those latest rules, bust it out, and try a couple scenarios and see if it is doing a little bit better for you. Read the rule book once all the way through, and you'll start to see how things come together. Probably not a huge leap from other of the complexity of other games, but there are nuances in how you actually learn to play well, not just implement the mechanics, but actually play well, know when to avoid combat, when to fight, when to use the terrain to your advantage. All those things, like any war game, takes a little bit of thinking through, but it'll be a good time for you. So, thanks for watching, folks. That's the review for Nations in Arms. I'm glad we could finish this one up. Had a good time. I'm ready to move on to some other games as well, but this one was certainly worth all the time and effort spent. Again, if you think this might interest you, I would recommend you give it a shot and see how it rolls for you. In any case, thanks for watching. Take care. Keep on gaming.